Okay, so what's really happening in your pollinator garden? So let's kind of take a look and dive into what a pollinator garden actually is. Most of us probably have a very good idea of what it is, but it's going to be a specially designed garden that's going to attract particular insects like bees and butterflies. Pat Raynard, can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Um, Hummingbirds and other insects. There are reptiles that are pollinators. Bet you didn't know that. Bats. There's all sorts of animal life that are pollinators. So we'll learn a little bit about what those all are. And these kinds of gardens are planted very specifically to have nectar and pollen producing plants that are going to provide food for these animals. So I know we've heard a lot over, a long time about not planting exotics because those are not going to produce the food that these pollinators or these native pollinators need. And yes, to a point, although there are some plants that are better than other plants at producing the food that these pollinators need. But it is always better to put something in your garden that's going to be native because that's going to be a food source for those animals. So key features, those are going to be your native plants. Of course, you want a diverse plant section, and we'll kind of dive into that and the whys and the hows, and then not using pesticides, even organics if you can get away with it. If you're going to use some type of pesticides or organics, then you want to make sure that those are used at the correct times because there are a lot of organic pesticides out there that you think are safe, but they're actually not. They're going to kill the pollinators just like the bad bugs. So you have to be real careful about what time you use those pesticides, and we'll talk about that. And you want to provide a water source. And then, of course, we don't want them to drown, so you probably want to put some kind of pebbles or something like that in there. But there are other benefits. So most people who garden also like to grow fruits and vegetables if they can. Of course, there are a lot of people that do just perennials or annuals or don't choose to have a vegetable garden or any fruits, but a lot of people do grow all. And so the big benefit is you're attracting those insects and other animals in to pollinate your fruits and vegetables. So you'll get a bigger and better crop. And let's not forget, you don't need a big yard to have a pollinator garden. You can have containers. So there's a lot of people that live in condos around here. Gwinnett County keeps getting, more and more packed, more people, just the whole metro Atlanta area. I have some people on here that are not in Gwinnett County, but are in the metro area. And so you may live in a small cluster home. You may not have a lot of property. You may have a balcony or just a concrete slab. And you can still have a pollinator garden out there by just having containers. So you don't have to have a 1 acre large garden for these things. You can, satisfy that requirement for those insects and other animals just by having a container. And the other good thing, you're going to attract some of the garden cleanup crew, I like to call them, and those are going to be your predatory insects, your braconid wasps that are going to lay eggs on your caterpillars, maybe your wheel bugs and things like that, praying mantises that are going to eat some of those bad bugs. So let's meet our pollinators. These are all original AI art, so no worries. I didn't swap them from anybody. But some of these you may look familiar from the pollinator census that you just did. But the pollinator census is only really looking at insects. It's not going to look at other animals that do pollination. So we have moths up in the top left, and then moving from left to right, we have ants. Ants are pollinators, believe it or not. You'll have beetles and frogs. Those are amphibians. You also have salamanders, little reptiles. They can do that. Bats are pollinators, and so are bees. Butterflies, of course, and wasps. flies, even little mice. Little field mice can be pollinators, and lemurs. We don't have those around here, but lemurs are pollinators in tropical areas where they live. Excuse me. And little goldfinches. And there are other birds, of course, that are pollinators as well. So, what are some of the benefits of having a pollinator garden? Well, it's going to change the ecosystem. I always tell folks, after you've moved into a brand new neighborhood and the builders have put the same old plants that are just greenery, you have to kind of come in and really just do a number on the environment to try to make it as hospitable as it once was, because a big grassy area will provide way more habitat, nectar in the way of wildflowers and weeds and things like that than a typical suburban lawn will, or landscape plantings, that kind of thing. So flowering plants are going to produce oxygen and carbon dioxide, just like any other plant will, and they're going to help purify water. A lot of us will get calls about erosion issues. And so we're sharing with folks the types of plants that you can put down to help prevent that by having the roots hold the soil in place. You can, have pollinators increase your fruit and vegetable production, like I mentioned. You'll have heavier crops of tomatoes. You'll have more beans. I know, for a long time, colony collapse disorder with honeybees was a big thing, and that was really all over the news. And it's not just honeybees, it's solitary bees and all the other pollinators. So the honeybees do the heavy lifting. They're very, very efficient at it, but there are a lot of other pollinators out there, and they deserve to be just as important and talked about as those honeybees do. Birds, because you're going to have a lot of birds that are attracted to the insects. So that's a secondary food source. You have the whole food chain going on, the food web, if you will. You'll have more hummingbirds coming into your yard. I know a lot of people mentioned they didn't see very many hummingbirds this year. So try to plant as many both native and maybe some non-native type plants, the kind that they like with a tubular flower, and also put hummingbird feeders out. You're an oasis in a larger landscape, and so you want to have as many welcoming things for these pollinators as you can. You'll also help support declining solitary native bee populations. A lot of people don't realize that these native bees are out there. They will live in holes in trees, and it's what these bee houses are. We'll show some pictures of those after a bit, but a lot of these are ground nesting bees, or they'll nest in cavities like that. And people are cutting trees down, not realizing that that's habitat for those bees. They also aren't putting bee houses up, and they clear out old weeds and things like that where they may put their young. And so their populations are going down. We try to educate folks that if you're seeing a lot of these little holes all over your yard in the early spring, it's probably ground nesting bees. They're not fire ants. Fire ants typically will get the big mounds after a rain, or they'll get more active in warmer temperatures, whereas these ground nesting bees typically are more active in early spring, not necessarily when fire ants would be. And you can also attract nocturnal moths. Most moths are nocturnal. There are some scape moths. I probably saw some of those in the pollinator census, and also the sphinx moths, or like the snowberry clearwing. I've heard lots of stories of those bugs being out in plentiful numbers around here. Tomato hornworms, believe it or not, those are large, really neat looking moths. So we don't always want to kill them. Sometimes it's nice to just plant some extra tomatoes for them. So why do insects and other animals pollinate flowers? Do they pollinate all of them or some of them? Well, that's a good question. So native plants native plants and pollinators co-evolve. We kind of understand that, I think, but I'm bringing that to everybody's attention. That's why we try to say native plants and the pollinators that are in the area go together, and that's why it's always better to put native plants in if you can. Of course, we do mix in exotics and some other things, and you will note that sometimes pollinators will use those. I know we have tropical milkweed, and that's better than nothing, but Obviously, having swamp milkweed or some of the others would be better. But about 80% of all plant pollination is by animals, and that's both insects and uh, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, all of those. And of course, the pollinator gardens are going to increase that rate of pollination. So that's a good thing. The pollinator census that we just finished, that is a perfect kind of transition into what this is. Maybe I should have done this one right before, but it also can kind of hammer home why we're doing that pollinator census. We want to bring more folks into the fold and why you should have a pollinator garden, why they're so important to our environment, and encourage people to make more pollinator gardens. I love showing some of the charts that they have on the pollinator census website, because Gwinnett County tends to be one of the top counties, and has been for pretty much the entire time the census has been around, in garden creation. And these are permanent gardens, and we're still seeing more and more every day, which is really nice. You're going to see more vigorous offspring results, because you're going to cross pollination. You might see some new colors of flowers and things like that. And those insects and animals are doing that for you. And that's higher genetic diversity. So obviously we know that genetic diversity is an important thing. And so the more you have crosses and back crosses and all of that, the more vigorous the genetics will be. Now, the remaining 20% are either going to be wind pollinated, and that's about 98%. Corn is wind pollinated. That's a good example. Or water pollinated. Probably a lot of people didn't realize that there's about 2%. That's mostly going to be like aquatic plants that have aquatic, some type of large flower. I'll show a couple of those, but that's usually where you're going to get those water pollinated ones. So why do plants provide nectar to pollinators? Well, the very obvious answer is they want to provide something sweet, in that they can provide those insects so that they come in and they get that pollen while they're there feeding on that nectar, and then they can move on to the other flower next door and cross pollinate, right? So the flowers are really smart in how they've set this up. That's pretty cool in itself. But as we go through this, we'll see even how much more cooler it is in how those flowers are actually accomplishing all of that. So the nectar is basically it's a reward to that insect or that animal that's getting the pollen. But how do they attract in those animals, those insects? They have a lot of interesting ways of doing that. And that's kind of why I wanted to do this presentation, because as you dive in, you start realizing how intricate some of this is. And it's just so amazing that nature has provided these mechanisms for how to spread their genetics around and how to attract the animals that will do that. So a lot of these are called floral signals or visual signals. We'll talk about that in a few slides. And nectar guides, that's probably the biggest one. And those are going to be your visual cues. So if you look down in that bottom left, you're going to see that yellow flower, and then the one that looks weird because it's kind of a bluish color. And that's what it looks like under UV light. So you see it's really, really light, and then it's dark. And those nectar guides are going to be the way that a lot of insects are attracted. So where is that nectar stored? Good question. It's stored in the nectary, which if you look at that little red arrow and down there, it's circled. It's all the way down in the base of that flower. That's where that nectar is. Okay, so how do plants attract the pollinators? Moving on, lots of stuff here. So they're going to use their colors. We kind of probably already knew that, right? They're going to use UV light, like I showed you in that last picture. Different patterns. They're going to use the nectar itself, which will smell very sweet and very yummy, pollen, different shapes, fragrances, all of that stuff to attract pollinators. And that flower's nectary, it can be at the base of that flower, and some of them are very long, like for a hummingbird that, it's got the beak and the really long tongue, or for a butterfly, or it might be very short. And, at the same time as they're hovering there, they're picking up that pollen to introduce to another flower. They also bloom at different times of year. So we always tell folks, hey, try to get plants blooming all year round, because here in Georgia, you may have 70-degree January days and you'll get bumblebees that'll come out or honeybees that'll come out, and they're foraging for food. So having plants that grow year round and to flower year round is a good thing here. Like if you're in Minnesota, not so much. You're probably going to have really cold weather. You're not going to have bumblebees out in the middle of January or February, but here you do. So you definitely want to plan for blooms all year round, or a year-round garden. The flower can be tubular shaped, like you see there. We talked about the hummingbirds. And so there's lots of different ways. It's very, very interesting. So pollinator syndromes, probably most of you have not heard of that. Some of you have. That's going to describe the different traits that flower might have that can be used to predict, excuse me, the type of pollinator that will be attracted to that type of flower. I kind of alluded to that. The red tubular flower that you saw in the previous slide had a hummingbird hovering over it. It's going to be pretty safe to say if it's reddish color or orange color, something like that, and it's a very long tubular shape, it's probably going to attract hummingbirds. And you can see here that's pretty much the case. So you look over here, you see on the left color, nectar guides. Remember that nectar guide is going to be that UV presentation. So you might have a white ring and then a dark center, and that's supposed to be like a big bullseye for that particular pollinator to find it. A different odor, some might be attracted. Remember, there's the corpse flower. It smells like dead bodies, and that attracts flies, of course. But a lot of nectar is probably going to smell sweet. And you can see bats and bees and beetles and birds and butterflies and flies. They all are attracted to different things. And pollen, you can see limited. It's very interesting when you start looking into this. And you probably already kind of subliminally knew some of this stuff, but now this puts it on paper. So maybe you can go, I was right. I did think that mountain mint, it seemed to attract a lot of wasps, and I didn't see very many butterflies at all on it. And yeah, I was right. That, fits with science. Yeah, science. So this just kind of reiterates what the pollen syndromes talked about. So this is just kind of an example. So they're going to prefer grouped flowers with a large splash of color. Most of the time you're going to see butterflies on, we'll just say, zinnias. When we did the pollinator census, all of the places that had zinnias were covered up with butterflies. They were very busy. And that's because they have very brilliant, flashy colors, yellows and oranges and pinks and whites and every color in between. And they're all very, very busy with butterflies. They're also hummingbirds and butterflies also prefer the same types of flowers, tubular flowers. And that's mostly because they have a very long proboscis. That's their little tongue that they can stick out. And that's what they use to reach down in there and get that nectar. They also prefer, in the case of butterflies, flat-topped flowers because they can sit there and rest while they're feeding. And they prefer the single flowers. It's just easier for them to reach down in there and get that nectar. So moving on, lots more ways, of course, of attracting. The fragrances, that's going to attract butterflies and moths. So I'm just going into a little bit more in that chart that you saw. So now you can see, instead of going cross-eyed looking at that chart, I'll talk about it. So the fragrances are going to attract butterflies and moths, flies and beetles. And that fragrance is what carries a long distance. It's very effective. And it's effective for humans too. If you ever go to a botanical garden and you're walking around and it's a little breezy and you're like, oh, that smells heavenly. And you start looking for whatever that flower, that tree is blooming. Well, the butterflies and moths and flies and beetles are doing the same thing. They're like, oh, that smells heavenly. And they're looking for those. So in the early spring, when those flowering trees are out there, that you almost always, if you walk by them, you're just going to hear this constant buzz. And that's all of the bugs that are taking advantage of that lovely nectar source in the early spring. Um, as a side note, pawpaw flowers, they smell like rotting flesh. And they attract flies and beetles. So, yes, flies will eat rotting flesh, but they're also attracted to flowers and they're pollinators because of that. So, some flowers have used that to their advantage. Ultraviolet light, that's also, again, called a nectar guide. Butterflies and bees will utilize these. You can see the flower in the middle, that's under UV light. It's like a big bullseye. It tells everybody, hey, landing lights right here. This is where the nectar is and the pollen. And then some plants are going to release pheromones. This is a neat trick. So this is why nature is just so interesting. So to attract their preferred pollinator, like bees or butterflies, they're going to release a scent that's very similar to a pheromone. Like, for instance, with these honeybees, they're going to have, there are certain flowers that will send out pheromones very similar to some of the pheromones that these insects, these bees will emit. And those will attract the bees. And then, of course, because they're colonial, they do that little waggle dance. And so all of the sisters will then fly over there and pollinate. So you can see that that's very effective. The eastern marsh orchid will actually mimic an aphid alarm pheromone. And those are food sources for hoverflies and their larvae. So that attracts them in because they think those aphids are there. They'll lay those hoverflies will lay their eggs in the plant's flower, and the pheromones keep the aphids away. How cool is that? That's very interesting. So again, how do plants attract pollinators? Visually. Insects, like for instance, flies, they have lots of eyes. I mean, if you think about the compound eyes that these insects have, so they're very showy. So you can see there, that's a trout lily there with those yellow flowers. They're going to have very showy sepals and petals, and at times they can be almost indistinguishable, and they call them tepals. A teeple in the steeple. Nectar guides. So these nectar guides, here's an iris. And you can see on some of those petals that they have those purple lines kind of point right to that yellow line. And then that leads right down into the part of the flower that's going to hold the nectar. So it's just like landing lights, runway lights. And then the shape, of course. So you have the native azalea on the bottom. Those are very long tubular flowers. So those will be mostly for the hummingbirds. If you've ever seen the hummingbirds around native azaleas, I have a lot of those in my property. And I see a lot of hummingbirds around my property because of that. And so again, that flower shape and that flower size are going to give you some visual cues as to what kind of pollinator is going to be that particular plant's mode of moving its pollen around. So for instance, beetle pollinated flowers tend to have a larger, more open flowers. Beetles are kind of bumbling pollinators or inadvertent pollinators. They kind of stumble across there and the pollen will stick to them. So it has to be a large flat area that they can just kind of walk across. So nectar spurs, I talked about mountain mint. That's going to protect the nectar from being stolen by robber insects and allowing the specific pollinators that prefer them, in this case, wasps and some flies, butterflies and hummingbirds, access to that nectar that has that have to have that proboscis or that really long tongue to get to it. Size. So the American lotus, you can see here, this is one of the plants that's going to be water pollinated, or the seeds will fall out and then they'll float along and then they'll find a place to root and grow. But they have a really broad landing area for beetles. And you'll have, like, for instance, irises. They produce a lot of very large flowers. Again, they have that landing strip to bring those insects in. And they put a lot of energy into that because that's how they want to pollinate. They have those nice big rhizomes. They, have a lot of energy that's stored in there. Ask anybody who's ever tried to get rid of a greenbrier how long it takes to kill one of those. but they're able to put a lot of energy into that showy display. Also, color. So here you have some a bird-footed violet that's going to attract the bees in that UV range. So this one, obviously, it kind of looks like it would glow, and it will. But bats and moths also might be attracted to white flowers that kind of glow in the dark because they're nocturnal animals. Again, visual. So nectar guides, let's talk a little bit about that because some people might have known, I should say, what a nectar guide was before tonight, but probably a lot of you didn't. Who knew that a flower would glow under UV light and would have landing strips, for goodness sake, or a bullseye? I mean, most people aren't going to know that, but that's how insects see. A lot of insects see, they see through the UV spectrum. So that makes sense that if you have a native plant that has coexisted with this particular pollinator, that it would evolve to have something to attract that particular pollinator. So again, in many bee pollinated flowers and butterflies, that's what you're going to see if you look at these flowers under UV light. It's pretty interesting. You can see that sometimes they're the reverse colors. Sometimes, like for instance, this black-eyed Susan in the top right, it's got the tips that kind of glow and then a very large dark area with some white in the middle, and that's to help the insect zoom in on that. Down in the bottom left middle, you see the that particular flower. It looks like it's just yellow, but under UV light, that center is like a bullseye, and that's what attracts that particular pollinator. And again, on the top, that looks like it's probably a dandelion of sorts, and it has this weird reddish glow with white petal tips, which is very interesting. So we don't see that because we don't see in the UV spectrum, but bees and butterflies do. So this would be how they find that pollen, that flower center for the pollen. Creating a pollinator garden. So we'll sprinkle some of this in here. So of course, it's kind of a little bit of everything. It's where that insect or that animal is going to spend its whole life, hopefully, if you've provided enough of the habitat and enough of its food source. So it's going to need something to hit all four stages of its life. So that would be adult, egg, larva, and cocoon or chrysalis. And then from there, it'll emerge into a moth or butterfly, whatever, or a larger insect. It should provide the host plants. So most people are probably going to know what a host plant is. If you don't know, that's perfectly fine. That's what you're here for. So for instance, butterflies, when they lay their eggs, it has to be on a specific type of plant. Most people are going to equate that with, say, the monarch butterfly and milkweed. So monarchs are going to lay their eggs on milkweed, and then those small caterpillars are going to eat that milkweed, grow, they're going to molt and get bigger and bigger and bigger until they're ready to pupate. And then they're going to go crawl off and find someplace sheltered, and they're going to form a chrysalis, and then they'll sit there for a while, and they're going to transform into that beautiful butterfly. But that's the type of plant that they feed on. They only feed on milkweed. And then, of course, there are others. There's Gulf fritillaries and swallowtails. For instance, Gulf fritillaries, those are going to feed on, some people call them maypops or passion flower vines. It's a native passion flower vine here. And those Gulf fritillaries, those bright orange caterpillars are going to feed on that. And then they will drop down and pupate in leaf litter. But you really want to provide some kind of plants that are going to provide that food source for at least 3 seasons of the year. And like I said, it could be 70 degrees in January. So you've got to have something, some type of water source. And that can just be, a rather large terracotta lid with, like you see up in the top there, some gravel, maybe a couple big flat stones and some sand. And that'll help provide, some type of mineral source. Sometimes if maybe you could put some soil in there, some clay, because there's going to be minerals in that soil. and then some water. And so that's a seep, and that's going to be perfect, a puddling area for butterflies. They're going to land on there and they're going to feed off of that. You need to have some kind of shelter for them, some place for them to hibernate. I know some people get these butterfly houses. I've yet to see butterflies use them. They figure out where they need to go. As long as you have the plants, they're going to figure it out. So just provide the plants. Undisturbed soil for soil nesting bees. Remember, I said in early spring, you're going to have a lot of these bees. They really look for kind of sunny locations, like a sunny sloped hillside without much grass, that they can kind of burrow down into that clay, and it warms them up. If you see them, leave them be. Just, don't worry about it too much. They'll be gone in a couple weeks, but in that amount of time, they will have their reproductive cycle, and you'll have next year's bees. And you don't want to use pesticides if you can get away with it. Sometimes, you get fire ants or something. You have to have some solution, but if you can, try not to use any types of pesticides. What do they eat? So butterflies and moths are going to require different things in different parts of their life cycle. So you can see there that orange caterpillar, that's a Gulf fritillary caterpillar. So the adults need nectar, and that provides carbohydrates for energy. And they also need that water and vitamins, salts, oils, and nutrients. That's why you have that puddling area. If you can do that on a muddy area and kind of keep it wet, they utilize a lot of the minerals that are in the soil. They need that pollen for protein. So if you ever looked online and you see bee pollen or something like that, that's what this is. It's bee pollen. That's going to be their protein source. And that's what the developing larvae, or the babies, are going to eat. Butterfly larvae, well, they eat leaves. So that's why they have this host plant. They need that host plant to provide them food. So that caterpillar is going to munch on that particular host plant's leaves. If you ever go out to the State Botanical Garden in Athens, right about now, I would say, or going into September, they plant milkweed out there. And the number of monarchs that they strip those plants bare, and you start seeing these fat striped caterpillars crawling across the pavement, looking for a place to go and form a chrysalis and pupate. You have to be real careful when you're walking because you might squish them. They are everywhere. I remember going on a tour a couple of years ago, and they were all over the walls of the buildings. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Very interesting. But you need to make sure that whatever you have is dependable. So you can't just, put a little water out there, plant a few flowers. You need to maintain it. So honeybees are going to eat the nectar that they forage for. If you have hives, you can also feed them sugar water, and that's going to help them get through some tough times. We don't have a lot of plants that flower for honeybees in sufficient amounts during probably late June through August, September, really until goldenrod and ragweed start coming in. That's called the dearth. That means that there's not a whole lot of food for these guys. So sometimes people opt to feed them sugar water to get them through this time, and also in the wintertime. So the female worker bees are going to make that honey from nectar. Don't think too hard about how they do that. It's kind of gross, but hey, it still tastes good, right? They're going to ingest it, break it into simple sugars, and then put it in the cells, and that's going to help prevent it from crystallizing. So they're going to also make bee bread, which is the pollen, honey, nectar, and bee saliva. So if you've ever thought about that, like the bee pollen, try not to think about it too much. But that's what they feed to the larval bees. And they may even go over and start feeding on ripe fruit, or eat the honeydew from aphids. So remember, I said the dearth, that's the time in the summer when we don't have a lot of flowering plants to feed them. I've seen bees at the trash can at a QT, and somebody had left a melted slush, and they were enjoying that. Let me tell you, it was covered in honeybees. I've seen melted M&Ms that were left on a picnic table, and it wasn't yellow jackets, it was bees. They were feeding off of that. So when they don't have a lot of options, they will make the options, and they will find things that are sweet. So fruit, typically that would be a yellow jacket, but sometimes it is bees that are feeding on that because they need the sugars. So bumblebees, they're going to have pollen in these little pollen baskets. So you can see that picture there off to the left. That's called a corbicula. And that's their pollen basket. They're going to mix that with nectar and honey and feed it to their larvae. So bumbles are ground nesters. They're going to be in the ground. We usually tell people just leave them alone. Yellow jackets are also ground nesters, but the bumbles have smaller nests. They have, probably about softball size or something like that. And then carpenter bees, they're also pollinators. I know everybody hates them in the springtime. You see them out there, they're drilling into your house if you have wooden soffits and fascia. And that's because that's what they do. They're drilling into your house because they want to lay their eggs so that they can have their babies. And they're kind of annoying that way. I had problems. I eventually just resided my whole house. So now I have hardy plank and they can't do that. I have very limited wood now, but they found my wood door on my screened-in porch. And so every year I have problems with them, but the cats like it when they sit there and watch them. So wasps, they're going to visit the flowers to get nectar and collect and transfer pollen. Mountain mint, they love mountain mint. Wasps are carnivorous during the larval stage. Did you know that? That mother wasp is going to lay an egg in a nest or a soil with a paralyzed insect. So sometimes you see, say it's probably a couple weeks ago, like cicada killers. They're going to go get the cicadas. They're ready to reproduce about the same time that those cicadas are around. So they will paralyze that cicada and drag it into their lair. It's stunned and they're going to lay their eggs on it. And then those larvae are going to eat that cicada. Same thing with like the braconid wasps. They'll lay their eggs on those caterpillars and those caterpillars will serve as the food source for those young. Beetle larvae and grubs, those are going to feed on wood or plants. They may have a symbiotic relationship with some type of fungi and spread and cultivate as food. That's kind of interesting. Of course, flies, they're going to feed on decaying matter, organic matter, as well as other stuff. And they're really gross. That's why we always say cover your food, because they're going to regurgitate their saliva onto that food and then they're going to suck it up, which is really gross. So how to attract them and keep them coming back? Well, you really need to know what your pollinators are. So which types of insects you have or birds, those kinds of things, and be caterpillar friendly. So don't pick them off your tomato plants, just plant more, because those are going to be your pollinators next time. And don't apply those pesticides. Definitely don't use systemic pesticides, even on ornamentals. If they have flowers, if you know they're pollinating insects, use those because that gets in the pollen. It'll kill them. And use beneficial insects. So plant the types of plants that attract those. You can cut down on the number of bad bugs by getting the good bugs, the good predatory bugs that'll eat those. And the best way to do this, if you want some pollinator-friendly native plant lists, Xerxes Society, they have lists that are specific by state, by region. I mean, it is a fantastic resource. So I put that QR code there. If you would like, you can totally go and check it out. If you've got relatives in other states, there's all sorts of information there. Flowers for 4 seasons. Again, I said, make sure you try to plant so that you have flowers for 4 seasons. It's warm enough here year round. You really have to do that. So here are some suggestions. I'm not going to read all of them, but like coreopsis in the spring, tulip trees. We have a lot of those around here. They're weed trees almost. Dogwoods, early spring, and then summer, you've got your milkweeds, your Queen Anne's lace, salvias, bee balms, tick seeds, yarrow, that kind of thing. Fall, asters, goldenrod. Goldenrod gets a bad rap. It's not actually the goldenrod that makes you sneeze. It is the ragweed that makes you sneeze. And then pineapple sage, that's also an interesting one. And then in winter, mahonias, winter honeysuckle, jasmine, paperbush plant, that's Edgeworthia. That we all love that one. It's very pretty. If you don't know what an Edgeworthy is, go look it up. They are gorgeous. I have one, hoping to have more. And hellebores, those usually bloom later in the winter. And this is kind of what we like to see. So this is a bloom chart or a bloom table. And you can see it's spread. You've got the months that go across the top, and then you've got the names of the flowers, scientific name, and then you've got their bloom time. So what you should aim to do, even if you only have a little bit of space, is try to pick something that's going to bloom at every single month of the year, something that's going to overlap. And you can see at the bottom, greens perennial, yellow shrubs, orangey red trees, and then vines. So do pollinators need water? Yes, of course they do. The larval and adult forms definitely need water. And butterflies, you can see there's some puddling butterflies at that seep. And wasps are going to get their water from prey and other sources like fruit and nectar. You can put the fruit out. That's a good attractor for butterflies. And also for bees, of course, if you've got some nice peach trees or plums or something like that. That's why you'll notice a lot of those down feeding down underneath. And I know some people like the butterflies, and when they land on there and they think that's pretty cool, it's mostly just because of the sweat, which we've been doing a lot of lately. It's really hot. All right, so how do butterflies and caterpillars protect themselves? So a lot of it's going to be camouflage. They want to look big and scary. You can see that one in the top right looks like it has eyes. It doesn't have eyes. It just wants you to think it has eyes. They also use that's basically mimicry right there. They're trying to mimic something. They use camouflage by hiding in trees and bushes. And they're going to use silk sometimes to kind of tack themselves down. The one at the bottom, that brown and white one, looks a little bit like bird poop, which that's fine. Nothing really wants to eat bird poop, so that's probably a good camouflage. And just in case you were wondering, that fleshy organ, that orange fleshy organ that you see there, that is in osmenterium, and it's meant to look a little bit like a snake. So really all they need is just to kind of shock whatever their predator is, usually a bird or something else, and that might give them enough time to get away. So what do they do in the winter? Well, some of them migrate south like monarchs, question mark butterflies, and some queens, and some overwinter in the south, Gulf fritillaries, sulfurs, painted ladies, some of the skippers, and honeybees are going to stay in a hive. You see, we don't really get a whole lot of snow like this one has, but even up north, they're going to stay in the hive, and you try to protect them as best you can. Bumblebee queens are going to be down in the soil, but basically they're going to lay their eggs, and then they're probably going to die, and then those will emerge next year as the next generation. Beetles are going to go dormant. They're probably going to get underneath, burrow into the soil, in the leaf litter. When we're out at events and things like that, we'll have pollinator garden handouts and beetle banks. So a cute way of calling what's a beetle bank? Well, that's all that dead detritus material that you have, leaves that fall off your trees, that kind of thing. Those beetles will go into that leaf litter. A lot of other animals will too. So try to leave that on the ground as long as you can in the spring, so that those animals can emerge when it starts to get warmer. Native bees are going to nest in the ground and pupate in the winter, and the moths are going to overwinter in that pupal stage. You'll have butterflies that are overwinter in all different stages. So what are you going to find in your garden? Well, you're probably going to find butterflies and bees, wasps, flies, moths, beetles, hummingbirds, and bats. You're probably not going to find lemurs. Maybe if you were over at Yellow River Game Ranch, you might, but in your backyard, probably not. So the butterflies and moths are very obvious, very showy, flashy, very pretty. Lots of them here, 160 species of butterflies and 1,000 species of moths. Think about that. Most of them are nocturnal, so you're probably not going to see them. They're going to have a 4-stage life cycle: your egg, caterpillar, pupa, chrysalis, and adult. Moth is egg, larva, cocoon, and adult. And they all have long tongues. So that's how they get their moisture, nutrients, and nectar. And they need the host plant, of course. That's very important. Very important. Moths, life cycles 30 to 90 days. So 1 month to 3 months. So you get a lot of these tomato hornworms. They pupate, they drop into the soil, they burrow in there, form their little cocoon, and then they'll emerge a month to a couple months later. Some of them overwinter, and they're going to spin that cocoon made of silk. Bees, they have eggs, larvae, cocoon, adult. Social bees in a nest, honeybees, for instance. And most people probably know, I think, but they are not native to North America. They were actually brought here in the 1620s by European settlers. So most of the bees that you're going to see around here are going to be European honeybees or Italian honeybees. Those are the most, common that you would see here. And previous to that, all pollination was done by other insects, native bees, birds, that kind of thing, beetles. And then, of course, the solitary bees are going to live in individual nests. So social bees forage for pollen, for protein and nectar, carbohydrates. And our honeybees, you can find them in the wild. Of course, you see the swarms occasionally. We'll get calls about those. So we have a list of folks that can go collect them. And we have good contacts for some of those folks that are help and work with us here in Extension. And bumblebee colonies in the nest. And, it's just an interesting life cycle. You usually don't see the bumbles. You'll just see them buzzing around to the flowers, but they're pretty quiet about where they nest. Solitary bees, I'm trying to speed along a little bit since we're getting low on time. So over 200 types. They don't sting very often. That's why we usually tell people just kind of let them be because they won't hang around very long. They just want to complete their life cycle. And 90% of those 4,000 species in North America are solitary. So if that gives you an idea of how many live alone versus the colonial honeybee, that's a lot. So you can see, I know they use the colony collapse disorder and they try to scare us about it. And yes, that is devastating, but we will be okay if something does happen because, again, they're not native. The honey's nice. We enjoy it, but they're not native. And it's 90% of the pollinators that are doing the work. Beetles, these are the oldest pollinators, and they don't have a specialized pollen pickup mechanism. They just kind of bumble across the flower, and they're attracted to it by the smell. So it's just going to be something that they smell and they go thinking there's going to be a food source, and they collect the pollen and then move on to the next one. So some beetles, soldier beetles, longhorn leaf beetles, tumbling flower beetles, and some weevils. Flies, I mentioned those earlier. So flies, this is a hover fly right here, but even bottle flies will be looking for the nectar. So like I mentioned, there are some flowers that smell like rotting corpses, and those will attract flies. So flies will have 2 wings and very large eyes. You could see here. This guy's mimicking a bee, by the way. This is a Mullerian mimic. That's what that particular type of mimicry is called. He wants to look like a bee so that the birds will think twice before they eat him. And these guys have eggs, larvae or maggots, and pupa and adults. And they like dark flowers, purple, and they don't use nectar guides. Remember, that's only for bees and butterflies. So they're going to lay maggots or their little babies on decaying organic matter. So anything that has a rotting meat smell, skunk cabbage, pawpaws, trilliums, that kind of thing. And they do hibernate, so tree crevices, in leaf piles, and things like that. Wasps. So wasps are social. They're going to have nests where they congregate. Yellow jackets, paper wasps, potter wasps, hornets. they're going to do most of the pollinating. And the easiest way to tell those, they have that very narrow waist. That's a very easy way to tell them. So besides the nectar and pollen, they're going to eat insect pests. So that's kind of nice. And only the female wasps have stingers. So I don't think we can ask them if they're male or female, but only the females have stingers. And they can't see red, but they can see UV light. So those nectar guides that we talked about, they can tell on those flowers where the white petals are versus the bullseye in the middle. Hummingbirds and bats. So think of how a hummingbird is built. You can see one feeding up in the top right. They kind of stick their face into that flower. Same thing with the bat, and that's how they get the pollen on their foreheads. So they're attracted to very bright colors, reds, pinks, yellows, oranges. Those flowers are going to fluoresce under UV light. And again, they are attracted to those tubular types of blooms. So mostly bats are going to be pollinators in tropical countries and desert type climates. We don't really have any of those here in Georgia, but out in the American Southwest, we do. And they prefer plants that bloom at night because obviously that's when they are active and alert and flying around. Nobody wants to see a bat in the middle of the day. We all think about rabies. So they're going to be out and about at night feeding and pollinating. Life cycle of the monarch. Real quick on these guys. So 4 generations to make their annual migration in September. That's a lot. You can see down in the lower right, those are their typical flyways. We have one in South Georgia that goes down into Florida, along the Gulf Coast and up into Maine and up into Canada. And then you have the one that kind of follows the Mississippi and up into Illinois and Indiana, and then all the way up into Minnesota and then out west. So the one that when we see the monarchs here in Georgia most often, that's probably going to be because we've had Gulf storms that have blown them up from their flyway along the Gulf up into our neck of the woods. Now, this year, some people have said, hey, we're not seeing a lot of monarchs this year. And that is because we have not had any large storms, tropical storms along the Gulf. We've had a couple that have skirted up the East Coast, but we haven't had any that have come up where we are here. So, of course, we're not done with tropical storm season, so we may see some later on, but that is why the numbers seem down. It's not necessarily because their population is down. So just be on the lookout. And insect hotels, this is a UGA publication, and it's a great one. It talks about how to produce or how to make basically a free insect hotel. You can use branches, leftover untreated timber, that kind of stuff. So it's going to be for solitary insects, which is great because those are the 90%, remember? And you can put those out and about. I've got several around my property. Just make sure they don't face west. They're covered. Putting them on a covered porch is a good idea. That way you don't have to worry about the water getting in there and destroying the larva. Make sure you swap out the straws or the you can use reeds. You can use branches. Just drill in there, usually 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. 0.2 to 0.04 inches in diameter, and get rid of the old materials periodically because you can have diseases and things that'll spread in there. How can you help? Plant those host plants. Take part in that great Southeast pollinator census. Be caterpillar friendly. Don't use a lot of pesticides. Leave that leaf litter in the garden for those pollinators to overwinter. Collect and plant seeds for native plants, and keep those bird feeders, if you like to feed the birds, keep them away from the pollinator garden. You want to put them on the opposite side of the house because you don't want them to eat the insects. You, of course, want to try to have plants that are going to bloom year round to provide that nectar source for those bugs, and make sure it's in a sunny location. And a good neighbor to your beehives, to your neighbors that have beehives. And Gwinnett, they do allow for beehives. So a lot of times you have someone that has a hot tub or a pool. Those bees are attracted to the chloride in the water. And beekeepers want to be good neighbors. They don't want you to think they're a jerk, but they can't obviously tell their bees what to do. So, one little trick that you can try that beekeepers will let you know about is you can take lemongrass essential oil in a bird bath with some type of pea gravel or rocks. Just keep the rocks in the bottom because you don't want to drown the bees, of course. And put some water in there and put that lemongrass, that essential oil in there. That lemongrass essential oil mimics a pheromone. And so you may be able to, if you notice, like you just get a brand new spa hot tub and you start noticing that there's some bees visiting it, get that out there and get it on the other side of your property. And you may be able to get those bees away so that they don't start using your spa as a water source, because they do like those chemicals. So that's a good tip if you have a beekeeper somewhere in a mile radius of where you live. So that's basically it. And I record all of these presentations that I do. I try to do a lot of new ones. Another big thank you to my mom, Shirley Bohm. She helps with a lot of these. She'll do some of the research for me and kind of start to throw it together. And then I flesh it out and add more detail and jazz it up so that it looks fun and pretty and y'all enjoy it. So if you want to check out some of these particular presentations and get some information on those QR codes, you can go to the YouTube channel there, the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. That's where they're posted. And I have a bunch that are up there. If you're a master gardener, you want to watch some of those. We're trying to get the word out for other counties' master gardeners for the continuing education credits, that you can watch any of these for continuing education. But of course, these are just for educational purposes too, for anybody who wants to learn something new that may not have known about this before. So you can always check these out if you have nothing to do at 3 a.m. and you need something to put you to sleep. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can drop those in the chat box. So let's see, that bee graphic is so awesome. Bee graphic. Was that the one with the pollinators? The one that I did AI? I don't know. That was fun to make. Is neem oil safe? So neem oil it's got a lot of different properties. So it's a fungicidal properties. It is used for insects. It's kind of a contact-based pesticide. So neem oil can be safe. Spray it either really early before the pollinators are out or later after the pollinators have gone to bed for the evening. So you can use it. It's one of the least or less toxic types of pesticides. But be careful when you're spraying it. Obviously, you spray it on a pollinator. They're not going to be really happy. It's a contact, so they're probably not going to do good. Are the orange ladybugs bad for the garden? I think those are the Asian variety you're speaking of. They bite. I hate those things. Those are the ones that get into the house in mass quantities in the wintertime because they don't like the cold weather we have here. So they'll get in the house and then they can't figure out how to get out, and then they die and they smell. I hate them. Are they bad for the garden? No, not necessarily. Bad for the garden. Are they invasive? Yes, they're not from around here. They're exotics. We don't particularly like them, but they do get killed off in the wintertime when we do have harsher winters. I don't stress about them too much. Excellent session. Well, thank you very much. Let's see, how close does a water source need to be to the pollinator garden? I don't put out water, but I have a creek nearby. Creek is fine. So if you have a natural water source, like a creek, if you have a marshy area, if you have a detention pond, something like that, that is perfectly fine. Those bees will come right up to the edge, and in the wet soil there, they'll kind of inch out, and then they'll get their water from there. As will the butterflies too. But if you don't have a water source on your property, you can make it really easy with just a a shallow terracotta, um, something. You got to have something that it's better if it has like a curled lip on it. Um, Make sure that you're always putting some kind of rocks in the bottom. You don't want to kill the bees. So making sure that, and this is what you can do for plants also, like a humidity, it's like a humidity chamber. But for insects and other bugs that need that water source, just make sure that you have some kind of rocks in there so that they can get that water and not drowned. That's very important. But yeah, just have some sort of water source someplace near your garden. But if you've got a creek nearby, that should be fine. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. Does anybody have any last minute questions? I'll answer other questions. That doesn't have to be about this particular presentation. Going once, going twice. All right, I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you everybody for attending. I appreciate that. And I'm going to go ahead and end it. So have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.